And welcome to this latest lunchtime session from Rural Kent in partnership with Alison Eardley Associates and Jim Boot. And today we're looking at an overview of an introduction to neighbourhood planning. And today's session is going to feature items on funding, on national policy framework, on how to deliver affordable housing, on new initiatives to support high streets, and on climate mitigation. For those of you who've been here before, you'll know the form. If not, we tend to ask you to put your questions in the chat. So at the end of the presentations, we'll run through those. We're looking to finish by 1:30. Sometimes we overrun if things get a little bit exciting. But Jim and Alison are going to talk between the two of them and hand over to each other as we progress. I hope you find the session both informative and entertaining, and thank you for giving up what looks to be a sunny afternoon to be with us. So Jim, am I handing to you first?
Okay, so I'm just sending another link to someone who didn't quite get in. All right, so very quickly, I think most of you are fairly familiar with Zoom now, but just in case, the mute button's down there on the left-hand corner. We do just ask you to mute yourself during the presentations, but we've got question and answers later on, at which point you can take yourselves off mute. Stop and start the video. Quite a lot of you have turned your videos off, but it's quite nice to see people. But if your bandwidth is struggling, if your broadband is struggling, do turn off your video, and that tends to do the job. The chat button is quite handy. We'll keep an eye on the chat when we're not speaking, if you've got any questions, do just prompt them in the chat during the presentations and we'll come back to them later. And then we've got closed captions. Oh no, we haven't got closed caption subtitles, I'm afraid, for this one. But if you want to put your hand up, and it is quite a small group today, so and ask a question, just use the raise hand function in the reactions there. It's that sort of biggish button in the reactions, not the thumbs up, not the clap your hands, but the raise hand button, and that will alert us that you want to speak to us. So that is fantastic. Alison, next slide. I'm going to be doing a little bit of this. So as Keith said, we're going to give a quick overview of neighbourhood planning, what's new for neighbourhood planning. Sort of the grants have just reopened. There's some more technical support available for neighbourhood planning groups and qualifying bodies. Talking about delivering affordable housing, because that is really the theme of all these pop-up events that we've done over the winter through neighbourhood plans, in the context of neighbourhood plans. Alison's going to talk about high streets, which there is some new funding available for if you're quick, and then supporting biodiversity and green infrastructure. So, and then question and answers at the end. So next slide, Alison. Right, unaffordable housing. So this is obviously an issue a lot of communities are grappling across the southeast, well, across the country really, isn't it? But perhaps strongest in the southeast of England. This rather wonderful sign, you sometimes see those signs sort of signing you to the next Persimmons, or other house builders are available, of course. And I just saw this at the summer exhibition that I went to with my daughter a couple of years ago in London, and I thought it was rather a good way to start the debate, rather provocatively. Next slide, Alison. Yeah, and this one I like as well. Bananas. What's that got to do with affordable housing? Well, it's like an extreme NIMBYism, isn't it? Build absolutely nothing near anyone, or any time ever. But bananas. So we don't want to be bananas. I guess we all come across that tendency in our communities. So next slide, please, Alison. And it's definitely what neighbourhood plans are not about. Alison, over to you.
Yes, so looking at the list of attendees, I think there's a mixture of people attending today. Some of you have got well on the way with your neighbourhood plans. I noticed someone's already on their review of their neighbourhood plan. And some of you might be just having to think about whether it's something you want to embark upon. And I mean, we've spoken about this in previous events, but just to give a kind of general overview of what a neighbourhood plan is. As many of you will know, they came about in the Localism Act coming up to 10 years ago now, so they're quite cemented into the planning regime. And they do give you an opportunity as a community, the parish council or town council, to have a real say in how your community develops over the next kind of 15 to 20 years in parallel with what's set out in your local plan core strategy. So as it says here, there's lots of things that you can include in a neighbourhood plan that might not have the detail within a local plan. For instance, green spaces that you think are particularly special to the community. And there's a very special part of the National Planning Policy Framework that enables you to designate them as so-called local green spaces, if you can justify them against some quite stiff criteria. And that's a very popular policy that we're finding throughout neighbourhood planning. Obviously, as Jim has said, making sure that you've got the right homes coming in the right places. Here in the southeast, you know, we're all being bombarded, I think, by the housing numbers. They're all being uplifted across each of the districts and boroughs, and there's quite a few local authorities at the moment that are coming to their Regulation 19 plans and setting out these site allocations in some really rural locations, and obviously quite sizable as well. Whilst we can't stop those through a neighbourhood plan, we can think about what sort of houses are delivered through those allocations. Are they in the right places necessarily? Are they at that right scale? Are they affordable? Are they the right mix, what we need? So that is something that we can have a think about. And of course, there's always the option to allocate your own sites for housing or employment or other items within your neighbourhood plan. So lots of scope there. Local character and heritage, another big area that we'll talk about a bit later on when we come to the national policy update, but lots of impact there you can have on the ground through your plan. And again, walking and cycling we'll cover in a little bit more detail later on in the conversation today, but ways of perhaps having an influence over travel that's taking place within your parish as opposed to strategic travel, which tends to fall within the remit of a highways authority, be it KCC, Kent, or the Highways England. Again, local businesses and tourism, community facilities. So it's a really broad spectrum of items that you can explore with your communities and think about how you want to set out how your land is used in your parish going forward, and also how you can ensure that your any planning applications coming into your parish are adhering to some of the sort of detail that you want them to at the very local level. And that's detail that would be greater than what would happen perhaps at a district level, which can't possibly cover every single parish in minutiae. So as it says at the bottom here, neighbourhood plans will ultimately become a formal part of the district to borough development plan. So they are a formal document. And because of that, unlike parish plans, town plans that you might have been involved with, you know, in the last decades or so, there's a formal process involved with putting a neighbourhood plan together. And it is quite lengthy, I think it's fair to say, but it has to be robust. It's going to be tested at examination, and there is going to be a referendum at the end of it. So that's it. So here's just an overview of the main steps involved in the neighbourhood planning process. So starting off with designating your area, this has become much simpler in recent times. In the past, you had to have a big consultation run by the district. If it's going to be the same area as your parish, however, you can skip that aspect and simply designate it, have it designated straight away. Gathering facts and evidence. One small box here, but it's probably the largest aspect of the whole plan in terms of heavy duty work from the volunteers on the ground and the local councillors that might want to get on board as well. Making sure that you're really getting to the bottom of what it is that the community wants to see happening in their parish, their town, their community over the next decade or so, and thinking about ways in which you might be able to actually deliver that, which takes you to the third item here about how you're actually going to address that through a planning policy. Is it something you can address through a planning policy, or actually is it more of an action that you might want to put sort of store in the wings, but isn't necessarily going to be examined by the examiner when it comes to that time? And at this stage, it's useful then to have a think, go back to the community, you know, what options have we got to deliver what they want? Let's talk to everyone and just make sure we're double checking that we're going in the right direction so that we can draft what's called the pre-submission plan, which is your first official draft of the document. And that's the one that's going to go out to a round of formal consultation run by your town or parish council. And that will involve making sure that you're enabling everybody to get involved with what's happening in it, whether they can have their say on the policies and so forth. And it will also go to a bunch of statutory consultees. And by that, I mean people like Historic England and Natural England, the Environment Agency, and so forth. And all of the comments that come back at this stage, it's a critical stage for most plans. This is the first big milestone that everyone's waiting to get to. Once you get the comments back, they'll come to you, and it will be a case of looking through all of them and thinking about what they mean for your plan document. Are they sufficiently useful to warrant a change in the plan, or are they interesting but kind of not that noteworthy? And you can go through each one and think about how you might amend your plan accordingly into its submission version, its final version that's going to be examined. And this is a point in the process where effectively your control over the neighbourhood plan is very much diminished, because you are going to, once you've got that submission final draft written, you're going to hand it over to your district or borough authority, and they are now responsible for taking it forward through the rest of the process, which firstly will be a second formal round of consultation. And this is why the process can get quite long, because there's all these legislative procedures that have to go through. So they will consult on it a second time. They will also, with input from you, arrange an examiner to look at it and check that it meets certain conditions and it's in conformity with national policy. And that examiner will take on board all the comments that came back from the second consultation and probably visit your area, have a look at some of the policies, anything controversial. They might write to you and say, can you have a think about whether you want to change this, or did you mean to say this? You know, somebody has raised, Historic England have raised this factor. Do you want to give me some idea about how you'd like that to be tackled? So you have an opportunity to feed back to them. And then ultimately they will write a report that will either say that your plan meets these conditions and passes, or most likely, with most plans, requires some modifications to it. Different planning experts have different ways of saying things, and you might need to modify the plan slightly. Following which, it will be the district or borough that then will take the plan through to referendum. You might want to do some publicity around that stage, obviously. But that is the point where everyone locally who has voting rights in your parish will have a chance to either accept or not the plan as the document to be part of the development plan. And I think I'm right in saying, Jim, that very, very, very few plans fail at referendum. And if you've done the rest of your work robustly, there's no reason to think that it should.
Yeah, only a tiny percentage have not made it. Yeah, less than 1%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's sort of a very quick nutshell of the process, which is, and I don't know, Jim, do you want to talk to this one about some things to think about along the way in that process?
Very quickly, but I think we just need to press on with the grant funding as well. So yes, I think Alison's covered it pretty well there. So I'm not sure I can really add anything apart from, it's that sort of, it's one of these things where you sort of start off by opening up the debate. I think a lot of people think, particularly working in parish councils, we probably know most of the questions, but it's really most of the issues in our community, and it's probably true to a greater or lesser degree, but you really need to engage with the community, because the key to neighbourhood plans is getting that buy-in, that ownership from the community, because obviously when you get to referendum, you don't want to be in that situation where they think, well, this plan doesn't reflect our views, and the only way to do that is to go broadly out into the community. And my background is community planning, sort of working on a range of different plans and strategies across district councils, unitary authorities, but also with urban and rural communities. And this process is tried and tested across the world, really, but is really captured in neighbourhood planning in England. So I think that's probably all I would add there. Shall we go to the next slide?
Yeah.
All right. Okay. So we're going to do a quick survey just to get some of your ideas, or a quiz, as it were. So we did this at a previous event. I don't know if you've had a go at this, but if you open up another, use your mobile phone or open another tab on your browser, on your tablet, laptop, or computer, and go to www.menti.com, and I'll just share my screen in a moment for this. Type in the number 4751 0784 and then follow the instructions. I'll just make sure that the poll is open. Yes, it is. And then I'm going to share my screen in a moment, Alison. So I'll kick you out from your sharing, and I shall share my screen. Okay, so just sort of really just getting an idea from you, what do you think about neighbourhood plans? So if you haven't got involved with one, you know, what's appealing to you about it? Sue has got a hand up. Go on, Sue. Take yourself off mute, Sue.
Could I have the code again, please?
Yeah, sorry, it's at the top of the page there, 4751
Yeah.
0784.
0784. Oh, is it? Sorry. Thanks.
So yeah, what is good or working well with neighbourhood plans? So someone said lots of financial support. That's a good point, actually. There is quite a lot of financial support. You can apply for up to £10,000 as a qualifying body. So that's either a neighbourhood forum or as a parish or town council. And then if you're thinking of allocating sites for housing, or you're going to be doing design codes, you can apply for a further £8,000. Yeah, it is greater public participation. That's what it's all about from the government's point of view. They want the community residents, the wider community involved in the planning system, local involvement. Yeah, okay, consultation. Yeah, of course. But the high cost even with the grant. Okay, so yes, we'll talk about what's the downside in a moment. That's sort of I was going to do the next one. That was the next question. But yeah, I think what I would say is to parishes that you do need to set a little war chest aside for your neighbourhood plan, maybe the same amount as you get in grant, and then for bigger town councils, maybe double what you have available in grant. Maybe not for each year, but maybe for the course of the neighbourhood plan. And of course, neighbourhood plans do spread over maybe 2 or certainly, or possibly even 3 years, and some have gone on a bit longer than that, where they've got a bit more complicated. Community growth there coming through. Right, I'm going to move to the next question. There's some really lovely ones there, but so what is bad or working less well with neighbourhood plans? So just put in your views on that one. So check that we haven't got any hands up at the moment. I don't think we have. Yeah. So lack of support from the local planning authority. I mean, they are supposed, in fact, they're required by law to support you once you've had your neighbourhood plan area designated. Sort of, is it the duty to cooperate, Alison? Is that sort of, is in effect a sort of similar kind of duty to work with local planning authorities?
Yeah, there are actually in the legislation, it's written into it, there are certain things they have to do to support you, including things like mapping availability. So it's definitely worth having a look at what they should be doing and what they can be doing and pressing for that. Yeah.
And not duplicating, you're not forcing you to duplicate work that they're already doing or work that they've carried out as well. So things like housing needs assessments and things like that, which we're going to talk about in a moment. So it can be seen as bureaucratic. These are really good answers, by the way. And we're going to send you these afterwards because I think they're quite useful, maybe with a bit of a sort of, you know, not a critique, but a response as well from Alison and I. We'll try and come up with some fuller answers to these afterwards, I think. Yeah, what are the costs? I mean, it is a bit, how long is a piece of string? It's one of those things, if you want a quick plan, you're going to have to pay more because you're probably going to need to buy in some expertise. But if you're happy to take a little bit longer with it and use a lot of voluntary help, obviously you can keep costs down. So it's a sort of, you know, quid pro quo there. Anything else you want to pick up there, Alison, before we move on to the next question?
Only just quickly, that's quite interesting about not as holistic as parish plans. And I mean, we often talk about this, don't we, Jim? Because we were both involved in parish and town planning in the past. And I mean, there is scope within your neighbourhood plan, and especially if you're clever with the funding, to not just focus wholly on policies, but also, you know, to have a chapter there to capture broader issues that you might have included in a parish plan, but clearly you're never going to get down to the detail that you might have, because you have got to focus on policy. Vincent, I can say, have you got your hand up?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. What I was going to say is we're working very closely with the parish next door because we've got a common boundary, obviously, in between us. How will this be respected by the people
Referendum?
by the planning authorities and in particular with regard to grants?
Well, I guess it depends. Are you both doing neighbourhood plans simultaneously?
Yes, we are.
But separately?
But we're having meetings together all the time to make sure we cover all the places between us.
Yeah, so effectively, you'll be dealt with as two separate planning groups by this kind of system, as it were. But it's great that you're working together. And I think it's really important, because there's going to be lots of cross-cutting issues, particularly on things like movement and community facilities and so forth, where it's going to be really helpful for you to be working together. But if you're actually doing separate plans, then you will be effectively dealt with as two separate entities.
Yeah,
right.
I think that's quite canny, Vincent, because because otherwise you'd only get, if you were doing just one plan, you'd only get one grant. But as you're doing two plans, you get two grants in effect, and two sets of. So I think you've been quite canny there, and but I do think the cooperation is excellent, and of course that when you come to examination, the fact you've got that cooperation with your neighbour will put you in a sort of good stead with your examiner, I think, as well. So I think a really positive approach that you're doing there.
But if we were to jointly engage a planning consultant, would the grants have to go through one, or would we have to take half each, or would we just, perhaps if we just got into invoice separately, maybe the answer?
That's a hard one to answer. We'd probably have to ask locality who give out the grants. But yeah, I think you would they would probably want to see separate estimates from the consultant for sort of separate pieces of work. But there may be economies of scale that could be achieved if you were doing sort of like employing someone to do, say, assessments of local green spaces or something. It might be that they might give you a better price because they've got a bigger piece of work. So
I had crossed our mind.
Yes, yeah. No, I think you've been very canny. So we've just asked, so how important are the following of creating a successful neighbourhood plan? Obviously, consulting with residents is really important, and it's interesting that you said it's nearly as important to liaise with your local planning authority. And there is that danger with some neighbourhood plans that because you've had maybe a poor relationship with your local planning authority in the past, or loggerheads over the local plan or something like that, or a planning application that you didn't agree with, you think, oh, you have to put all that baggage aside and just say, this is our neighbourhood plan. We need to make it work with the local planning authority, who ultimately will be using it to decide on planning applications in your parish. So really important there. Gathering evidence, even more important. Well done, everyone. Full marks for you. Because it's really robust. Although we've got that consultation is really important, robust evidence base, the facts and figures, the assessments need to sort of stack up as well when you're writing your policies. And yeah, we're probably not going to talk about site promoters much today, but we're talking in quite a lot of neighbourhood plan areas, not even where they're not allocating sites themselves, we are still having conversations with developers, site promoters, landowners, to try and get better quality development that perhaps is inevitably going to happen in your area. And there's that sort of slight sense sometimes that we shouldn't be talking to them, that could be a compromise, but I would encourage people to engage. Alison, any thoughts on that before we move on?
No, I think that was very succinctly put.
All right, okay. And then our final bit of our quiz is what can neighbourhood plans do? And Alison's touched on some of this already. So can they seek to protect areas from development? Can they set design codes for new development? Can they promote less development in the adopted local plan? Bring in speed limits on minor roads? designate listed buildings, protect wildlife areas. Is it open? Yeah, yeah. All right. Okay, good. And give planning permission for affordable homes or community facilities. Yeah. So yeah. Okay, so you're absolutely spot on the promoting less development than in the local plan. Although often neighbourhood plan groups would like to do that, unfortunately you have to go with what's in the local plan. What you can do sometimes, and I think Tame in Buckinghamshire did this, is that they actually, rather than have an urban extension on their town, they sort of pepper potted their development around the edge of the town because they wanted smaller scale developments, same quantum or volume of housing, but pepper potted rather than in an urban extension, which was the aim of the planning authority. So yeah, you can, take a different approach, but still achieving, the government's aim of more homes, of course.
It is, I'll just say it is quite tricky though. I think they were absolutely right. There is the potential to do that, but it depends what stage your local plan is at and whether it's an early enough stage to be able to kind of make those choices. Some plans are kind of stuck with a very well progressed local plan that's already got well down the road of site allocation. So it's something to have a think about.
So Alison's going to talk about protecting wildlife areas, beauty spots in a minute, so I won't go into that. Yes, you can, if you do a neighbourhood development scheme, you can actually almost in effect give planning permission for a community centre or affordable homes, which of course is one of our aims, to see more rural affordable homes. Set design codes, yeah, this is a newish thing. I mean, they've always been strong on design neighbourhood plans, but now we can actually set design codes for new developments, and that's really getting down into nitty-gritty detail of what new developments should look like. And I think this is a really interesting area and probably worthy of a whole session just on its own, which we'll have a think about and maybe doing something along those lines. So yeah, we can't bring in speed restrictions on minor roads, much as we would often love to. So I think that's it from, yeah, I'm not going to, so you can, I will leave that one up and running, but I'll take it off the screen, as it were, so that we can come back to your questions later on. So I'll leave that one up and running, but I'm going to stop sharing my screen, which I can do somehow. Or Alison's done that for me.
And yeah, I mean, we won't dwell on this too much because we've talked about it a little bit, and you'll be getting the slides afterwards, but this is just a kind of checklist based on that poll of what you can and can't do. Just very, very quickly, I think a few people had said we can designate listed buildings. That isn't something that you can do through the neighbourhood plan. You can't nationally put a national listing on a building, but you can designate it as what's called a non-designated heritage asset, which again, we might talk about in a future session if we're doing something on design and heritage and so forth, but just to make that point. Right, so grant funding and technical support, which had a few questions about funding. Jim, do you want to give an update on the current situation now that it's all reopened again from locality? Yeah, so the basic grant was 9, it's gone up to 10, but that includes £1,000 for COVID specific costs, for maybe doing an extra delivery of leaflets or something like that, or maybe buying a Zoom account or something related to COVID and the costs of doing that. All these grants are available through the locality website, and we'll give you a link to those, their neighbourhood planning website, and we'll give you a link to those later on. As I mentioned, if you're allocating sites for housing or design codes, you can apply for an additional £8,000. So that's quite a low bar to get that additional funding, particularly in terms of design codes, because most neighbourhood plans want to do something around design. More importantly is technical support. I think probably, should we just move on to the technical support slide, Alison? Right, that's a little bit hard to read, but this is like free support to you. You pay as taxpayers, I suppose, but it's free to you as a qualifying body, as a parish council or local community. And so you can get help with setting up a neighbourhood planning group if particularly if you're in an urban area, a non-parished area.
You can get housing needs assessments done for you, and we'll talk about that in a moment a bit more. You can have site options assessments, so you might already have a list of sites. You've maybe done a call for sites, or you're using the Borough Council's most recent call for sites, and you want to assess those sites, maybe get an independent assessor in to look at those sites. So these are all really good packages, but they would cost you tens of thousands of pounds if you were buying them from a consultancy yourselves. So they're well worth thinking about. There's quite a lot there. Master planning is sorry, I was just going to mention master planning is quite a nice one that people are also applying for with design code. So maybe where you've got quite significant development within your community. Our friends, we're working with Pembury at the moment, and they're getting about 350 new homes in their community over the next 15-year period. And so they have applied for a master planning package to try to do like an aerial view, a bird's eye view of those developments, and seeing how it can be much more connected, joined up with the existing community, but also with new communities. Alison, over to you for that town centre funding. Oh, am I going to
yes, so, you can do if you like.
You do it, then go on.
Yeah, all I was going to say here just briefly is that when you go into the locality website to look for your grant and technical funding, you might notice that there's a few new funding opportunities that have opened up this year. One of them relates to a question that's been asked actually about whether there's some kind of standard protocol for producing a template of the neighbourhood plan. There is a fund where people are going to be piloting simplified neighbourhood plans. So that might help towards producing something more universal that people might be able to kind of access in the future. But this one fundamentally is about high street regeneration. It's applications only open till kind of mid 17th of May, as it says there. And effectively, it's a new grant, given obviously the COVID situation and the impact that has had on high streets, following, of course, all the other impacts that we've seen in our high streets relating to supermarket competition, online, mobile competition as well. There's now a grant for particularly town centres, I would say, but some village centres as well, in terms of bringing forward schemes that might help to regenerate those high streets. And perhaps also look at how you could make them a better mix of uses so that you're not fundamentally relying on retail for them to be viable and vital. So it's just something to flag there, and it kind of links in with the master planning aspect of, are there ways of redesigning your high street or your village centre or your town centre that can make them more accessible to local people, easier to get around, more attractive, perhaps have more shared space to bring people together so that they can undertake activities in a more social way once we're able to, of course, and bring in greater footfall and perhaps slightly redefine the focus of the town centre or the high street away, as I say, from purely retail and bringing it back to this sort of shared community sense of space. So that was just quickly to flag that. If that would be of interest to anyone, do have a look at it, because there is a very short deadline involved. And then other funding. Did you want to pick this up, Jim? Or
no, you carry on. Sorry, I was just responding on design code.
That's all right. Yep, you can carry on with the design codes. So we just put together some other thoughts that you just might not be aware of that are happening at a national level. So first up, as it says here, over 1,000 communities have reached this major deadline, sort of milestone in the neighbourhood planning rules. We've got over 1,000 communities have got one made or adopted, made being the official term there. We're going to be continuing the funding for neighbourhood planning through locality. So those of you that are setting off on the process, plenty of time still to get on board and have a go at writing your own. And as I say here, this kind of pilot about trying to simplify the process. So this might tackle some of the problems people have been facing in terms of just simply how long it's been taking to get a neighbourhood plan through, and whether there's a sort of lighter touch process that people might be able to access instead. And then just at the bottom here, just a quick mention about first homes. I think we've mentioned this at previous workshops that we've run. It's a new policy that the government have now adopted, And again, looking at giving out grants for people to pilot how you can put up forms of affordable housing as first homes, so kind of replacement of the starter home scheme, and equally help to build more and more people looking to build their own homes. Local authorities having now to supply plots to anyone that demands a plot to build their own home and self-build and custom build. And there's lots more money in the pot for that. And more neighbourhood plans are including clauses on self and custom build and supporting that, and perhaps allocating specific sites to it. And it can help bring forward more affordable homes too, depending on who owns the land that you're allocating. So lots of exciting things in terms of funding at the moment that you might want to have a look at through the locality site. And then just on the national kind of policy side, I've been contacted by a few councils this morning actually, wondering what the implications, I don't know if you're aware of this, about this very recent High Court ruling that happened, I think it was yesterday, about whether or not local councils, parish and town councils, can continue to meet virtually, which obviously they've been doing during the COVID times. And I think it was Hertfordshire County Council took the government to task about this and said, can we extend it? And it's been declined. What this means for neighbourhood plan groups, I think on the whole, is probably good news in that I don't think it impacts you greatly, because the way that neighbourhood plan steering groups are often set up is at kind of arm's length from the council itself. So, and they don't tend to have voting rights at council level. So I think if you've been meeting your groups virtually, then you can continue to do that. If you have set up your neighbourhood plan group as an actual formal committee of your parish council, then you might need to have a little look in more detail about this and see what the implications are there. Then we're moving on to just the planning white paper, which sort of rumbles on in the background. As we know, the consultation's closed and the results are being considered by government at the moment in terms of what that means, alongside some potential changes to national planning policy in relation to design, which is obviously a big feature, as Jim said earlier, and one that we might well run a separate session on at some point. So there's just a couple of points here about things that might be changing in the national planning policy framework. Emphasising that neighbourhood plans don't just have to allocate small amounts of homes, but they might want to look at bigger sites. And also really emphasising this, the role that design codes, design guidance, and master planning can have at a very local level. And in that line, the National Model Design Code has been released on the back of the National Design Guide that came out last year. And if you haven't got anything in concrete at your local level, at your local district level, that provides a huge amount of detail actually now that sets out some overarching parameters about design that you might want to look at, so that you can then unpick what that means for you at your neighbourhood level. And then the third point here, just talking about, obviously we've got this net zero carbon aim for 2050 that the government is aiming for. And literally in the last few days, last week or so, we've now put a commitment in through government to reduce emissions by 78% by 2035. And I think this is a really interesting thing to have a look at through your neighbourhood plans, because there's so many policies now that you can incorporate that can help deliver that target. And that target will help justify those policies. So things like 20-minute neighbourhoods, can you walk and cycle around your town or parish in a certain amount of time? Can you encourage people to be using active modes of transport as opposed to jumping in their car? How are there community renewable energy schemes that might be of interest? And sustainable design, huge amounts of things that we can do on that. I do think, Jim, we probably should do something on sustainable design and design codes going forward, because we keep coming back to this point and there's a lot to say on it, isn't there?
Yeah, it's a really exciting area, and I think there's some really interesting work being done on this. So yeah, it'd be great to share some of that with you.
Okay, so we've got 3 more big topics or medium topics to cover, and we've got a little bit of time left. So should we go on to affordable housing and neighbourhood plans?
Yeah, very quickly. I was just going to say, I'll put it on the chat, you know, we were a bit late starting. We had these technical issues at the beginning, so we'll just probably stay on a little bit longer today. So particularly for questions and answers, I hope you can all stay with us, or as many as wish to can stay with us. So we'll try and do that. So yeah, just affordable housing, as I said at the beginning, it's a big motivation for a lot of people in developing a neighbourhood plan. Not the biggest necessarily, but it is there for a lot of people. You know, what do we mean by social housing? I mean, or affordable housing? I guess we mean the old sort of idea of council housing, although that is now transformed, but also cheaper market housing as well, and starter homes and that kind of thing as well. So I think a lot of issues in communities around also having, you know, since COVID brought this back into our sort of mind's eyes around key workers as well, and housing for key workers, you know, because even a policeman or a nurse or whatever, the salary for that is not sufficient these days to buy a house on the open market. So, you know, the deposits required, etc. So, so very challenging, although the government is trying to address that, but it's about what you can do in your local community as well. And, you know, we're really lucky to have this event hosted by Rural Kent today, and Rosemary's here from Action for Communities in Rural Kent. She is their Rural Housing Enabler, and just say a few words about your local housing needs surveys, which we've used extensively in neighbourhood plans, Goudhurst, Horsmanden, Lamberhurst, etc., etc.
Okay. Okay, yep, thank you, Jim. Yep, I'm Rosemary Selling. I work for Action for Communities in Rural Kent. As Jim said, I'm the Rural Housing Enabler. Yeah, just a few words really about housing needs surveys. Obviously, they're a very important starting point in bringing local needs affordable housing forward. You know, one of the services that we provide is sending out the surveys. Can be via neighbourhood planning groups. You know, the purpose of them is to establish what the local housing need is locally, and you know, this can involve establishing the type of housing, the size, the tenure. We've talked about lots of different types of tenures, including the first homes, but it could also be affordable rented properties and shared ownership. So the housing needs surveys are really kick off the sort of the whole process really of working together to establish the need, and then hopefully bring you know, a scheme forward that is suitable for the parish that we're working in. So I'm happy to sort of answer any further questions, perhaps in the Q&A or yeah, as we go along.
Thank you very much. And while we're on the subject, the Kent Housing Hub has been a sort of a partner on these sessions as well earlier in the year, and Alison and Tessa from there, and Rosemary can act as a sort of a pass you on their details to you, or pass you on to them to help out as well. And they're looking in particular at issues like co-housing. I think, you know, another sort of aspect of COVID is, you know, just people living on their own, elderly people, but lots of other people as well living on their own, and how isolated they've become. And I think a lot of people have become interested in the idea of co-housing, where you might live in a sort of a group of homes, but sharing facilities like a living room, kitchen, even having shared overnight accommodation, that kind of thing, so that people can live in a smaller, more environmentally friendly and cheaper home to run, but sharing those facilities, and also the social aspects as well, which are really interesting. You can have a housing need assessment done as part of your neighbourhood plan by applying to locality. They will appoint normally ACOM, a big planning consultancy, to do a housing need assessment. So that will sort of look at what the mainly what the local authority have done in terms of assessing housing need, but there is an element they will be looking at the providing for the need across your district as well, as a sort of you know, your parish or town providing a proportion of the overall district housing need. And so that can sometimes not always provide the answers that people necessarily want to hear. So probably need to get some advice before going down that route. And then just linking in with Rural Kent's housing needs surveys is that might then lead to working with Rural Kent to find what are called exception sites. And some of you might be aware of these. Is a site that wouldn't normally get planning permission for housing, maybe because it's outside the village envelope or the limits to built development, but for a specific rural housing, affordable housing scheme for local needs, for local people, you can exceptionally build on some sites, and these are generally made available below what the market would normally pay for a development site. So you're not talking the £1 million per acre that Persimmon will be paying for developing a site. It's much lower, much closer to agricultural land values, and just makes the whole process much more affordable for the housing association, or maybe even a community land trust that might be developing this. So a whole big area of work there, but all ways that neighbourhood plans are starting to think addressing affordable housing for their local communities. Alison, next slide, probably.
Yeah, I just added in here actually, Jim, just which people can read perhaps in their own time in the slide set if you want to send it out, but just some examples of the sorts of things you might include in a policy related to affordable housing in your plan. And in a couple of examples, top one from Horsham, bottom one from Ticehurst, who have both passed examination and both had affordable housing policies within them. These are just some examples you can have a look at.
And we will make these slides available even at the end of this session, actually. We might be able to just do that, pop them in the chat. Alison, over to you.
Yes, we just wanted to touch on a lot of neighbourhood plans now are looking at putting policies in relating to their high streets, village centres and so forth. And I just wanted to make everyone aware, which you may not be, that back in September last year, what's called the use class orders changed. And basically every building that you see is categorised into a different, what they call use class, which is represented by a letter. So in the past, up until September last year, and in fact, I think it's still in place till August this year, but it's going to be shifting. Shops and cafes, for instance, which you might usually find in a village centre, were under use class A, and other things like offices came under a B use class, and then more kind of community things like health centres, education, leisure and recreation and so forth came under class D. But from September, the government has kind of revoked all of those and merged them all into these new categories that you can see on the right. So the biggest kind of difference being that the shops and offices and parts of the leisure and recreation are now in this new class E clustered together, which means that you now don't have to apply for planning permission to change, say, a shop to an office or an indoor sports centre to a cafe and so forth. Whereas in the past, you would have had to have applied for planning permission between these different uses. We're often finding that neighbourhood plans like having policies that, you know, to kind of encourage mixed uses within centres, as we discussed earlier, you know, this idea of making sure that we're not just relying on retail and so forth. And I think that was probably the government's intention with this, to make it easier to shift between uses, so that if you've got vacant buildings, you don't have to go through an extra hurdle of applying for planning permission. It allows greater flexibility for a particular building that you might want to then make as a community building. And also the idea that you could have flexible use within a single building. So if you want to have office space during the day for, say, a co-working hub, but you want to turn it into, I don't know, a creche or a health centre, or, you know, sort of recreational gym in the evening, then this allows you to do that much more flexibly. So it's just worth having a think about when you're putting your plans together. And equally, something else that's happening this year later on, which was just announced very recently, is these changes to what we call permitted development rights. And again, these rights mean that there are certain situations where you don't have to apply for planning permission through the system for something to happen. And in the past, as I say, you'd have to apply for planning permission to change from one use class to another. So, you know, from A to a B. Now they're going to make this new use class E, which, as it says here, it's quite muddling, so there's all these letters and definitions, but use class E, which now will encompass all these different uses. If you want to then change from a use class E to residential, you won't require planning permission to do that. And as it says here, this is really controversial because it means that you risk eroding your village centre, your high street offering, if people wish to convert to residential. But on the other side, the argument for it, certainly from a government perspective, is getting, there's a housing crisis. High street centre housing is in high demand. It's near local services and it creates greater footfall. So there's kind of pros and cons. And I've just put in the pink box here, which again you can kind of read in your own time. But these are the criteria that will apply. And I think the most important one is that it will apply in conservation areas, but not in AONBs, which I know many of the places in Kent, their village centres fall within an AONB. But it won't apply if your building is nationally listed in a conservation area. And this is, I think, something that a lot of neighbourhood plans might want to have a think about, maybe putting a policy here. If your village centre lies in a conservation area and you're worried about your offerings being eroded perhaps into residential, then what you'd need to do is perhaps put a policy in there that does this. It looks at what would the impact of the loss of that shop or that cafe or that bank be on the character of your conservation area, and how would you define what that means in your plan? Because that might be the one way of trying to safeguard some of these local facilities and assets. So just something to have a think about there.
Listen.
And then the final, oh yes, Vincent.
Can I just throw in a bit of a warning here, because we fell foul of this. We found that in the local development plan for the Borough Council, they had included us in an LS category.
Right.
Which meant we were counted as suppliers of facilities.
Okay.
They had linked us in with the village next door, which has got a train station, which is actually a facility. It's got a Waitrose, a huge shop. We haven't got that. We've got a post office. But once we were in that facility, they used this to try and get what they wanted with whatever planning they wanted. So I just say to everybody, check what your local district plan is doing and how they're allocated you.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and one that I think you definitely should look at. So in your local plans, particularly the emerging ones that you've still got a say in, have a look at what they call the settlement hierarchy that's set out normally towards the beginning of the plan, and see where they've placed you. Sometimes, as you say, that they can cluster communities together, even though you don't feel that you're connected. And what that means is that you might go from being a really small village that wouldn't necessarily attract housing, for instance, to a bigger service centre that's suddenly, fair game for allocations. So yeah, really good one. Well pointed out there. Thank you. So the final thing I wanted to talk about today was just this idea of biodiversity and mitigating climate change, which inevitably is getting higher and higher on the agenda. More and more plans are looking at how they can tackle this through at the community level. As I mentioned earlier, we've got this net zero carbon target that collectively as a nation we're seeking to meet by 2050. There's been this additional target for 2035. And we've got the Environment Bill that's coming out, that's currently being sort of ping-ponged through Parliament at the moment, which sets out lots of different things in relation to this, one of which is getting more interesting from a neighbourhood planning perspective, which is this idea of nature recovery networks, biodiversity, green infrastructure networks. And we're now finding that, if the national planning policy framework says that you have to, through development, provide what's called net gains in biodiversity. And that's defined there in this yellow box, i.e., you've got to make sure that the biodiversity left behind after you've done your development should be higher than what you had in the first place. So you're improving the biodiversity and local network of nature. So local neighbourhood plans are starting to get a bit savvy about this. And one of the things that we're working with a number of groups on is mapping out what this means at a neighbourhood level. can you identify what your green infrastructure network is, the corridors of green space that allow wildlife to move around, maybe have public access, maybe don't, the different landscape character types that exist within your neighbourhood, so that A, you can say to developers that this is our network, this is what's really important, and B, if development is going to happen, if a net gain can't be delivered on site, then you might be able to say, look, there's an area of opportunity here in our parish where we want to create some more habitat. So why don't you put the funding there and extend it in a place that we can kind of have some control over? And I've mentioned the Wildlife Trust here. They produce a really useful report that I would definitely recommend asking them for your parish, which sets out all the different species that have been identified. And often they will look at things like networks of green space and biodiversity opportunity areas that you can then start looking at how you could connect those up. And an interesting read, if anybody wants something over the bank holiday, is that Natural England have just released a new report on carbon storage and, I can never say the word, sequestration by habitat, which has looked at the different types of habitats and how good they are at absorbing carbon, obviously mitigating the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. And these are the areas that come up and score particularly highly. I'm down in Faversham actually, and we've just had a big solar farm given planning permission on a salt marsh, which obviously salt marshes are very good at storing carbon. So whether that was considered within that decision it will be interesting to kind of have a look at. But it would be worth a read, and I think this is all good evidence to try and up your climate mitigation policies within your plans. So, Jim, do you want to just talk through the resources? I don't think we need to say too much, just that they're there. Oh, you're on mute, Jim, sorry. Oh, you're still on mute.
So I was just trying to upload our presentation, so I was having a little bit of technical.
Oh, sorry.
But I'll do that in a moment, and also I'll send it round afterwards, actually, because we've got all your email addresses, so I'll send it round straight after the event as well, if I struggle to upload it. But yeah, so people have asked, are there any toolkits, templates on writing a plan, that kind of thing. There are lots, and this roadmap guide is probably the best place to start. Very detailed, every aspect of neighbourhood planning addressed in that, and you can download that. And then there's some very good guide on consulting on a neighbourhood plan during the current COVID difficulties as well. That's one of the planning policy guidance notes from the government, and they're very good as well to find out the legal sort of aspects of it. Yeah, I mentioned the locality toolkits there. And then transport, I think it is something a lot of communities are trying to address, transport issues in their local communities. And this guide on transport matters and neighbourhood plans is a sort of very good way to steer your way through that difficult area. And then the list of technical support packages available from locality, these master planning ones, these design codes ones, and things with helping like on issues like strategic environmental assessment. So lots of useful stuff there. Alison?
And here as well.
Oh yeah, and then these are from our earlier event really, where we looked at sort of digital engagement during COVID and some of the tools that we've been using around that as well. So just some more tools there as well. Create Streets is a slightly cheaper version, so it's certainly worth looking at if you're looking at sort of some kind of mapping engagement tool to add to your website or your Facebook page. Create Streets, I'd highly recommend having a chat with them. So we're going to stay on for another 10 minutes or so for questions and answers. Sorry we've overrun today, a bit late starting, but Keith, did you see anything? Oh, I see Robert's got his hand raised. Robert, do you want to fire away?
I've got two questions. One is regarding affordable housing and the other one is high-rise housing. With affordable housing, it seems throughout Kent that majority of developers are working to a 40% figure. but is it possible in a neighbourhood plan to influence the percentage of rental accommodation as opposed to part buy, part rent, bearing in mind that most of these 40% affordable housing goes on block to housing associations? So that's the first question. Is it possible to influence the percentage in the neighbourhood plan?
Yeah, so what you can, well, your local plan will set out the percentage of any given development, usually of 10 houses or and under, etc., of what percentage affordable has to be delivered. And they might go as far as saying how that might then be kind of unpicked in terms of the different types of affordable housing. But this is definitely something that you can do in your neighbourhood plan. If you've got the evidence to show that, of the 35% part of the site that's going to be affordable should be, delivered in this particular weighting, and you can underpin that with evidence, which might come from one of, the local housing needs studies that we talked about, then yes, that's definitely something you could put in there.
Okay.
What you can't do is up the original percentage. You can't suddenly say we want 70% affordable overall.
No, we wouldn't want to do that, but we would like to ask the question of the of our town, people of our town, what they would like to see. So thank you. The second question on the high rise, we had quite a detailed questionnaire, and we actually asked people on what height they would like to see development in the town, and 76% did not want to see any more than 4-storey. But since we did the questionnaire, a development has been approved by the Inspectorate on Appeal with 11-storey blocks and 8-storey blocks in the town centre. So where does that leave us with our neighbourhood plan? Because we have the evidence from local people that they don't wish to see high-rise development in our town, which up until recently was the maximum of 3-storey. Can we still put this in our neighbourhood plan to limit the height of development?
Yeah, there are examples of neighbourhood plans that have included things like this, height of buildings, scale of buildings. I think what I would advise, though, is that you need a bit more justification than simply the community don't want to see high-rise buildings above 4 stories. I think what you need to do...
If you've got 76% of all replies, that's pretty good evidence, isn't it?
Excellent evidence, but I think it's not enough alone to be evidence. I think what would be helpful is to have a look at maybe trying to, because I think it is probably set within a character policy. Why do you not want taller buildings? It's most likely going to be because it's out of keeping with what you would describe as the local character of your settlement.
Yeah.
So you would need to have a think about, well, what does that mean? What is the character of our settlement? And can you do a kind of survey of what buildings exist already and what the impact perhaps has been of this approval on the character, so that in the future you might be able to restrain that from happening again. And this is where, if you're kind of stuck on how to do that definition work, I think Jim mentioned earlier, there is funding and technical support through locality to help you on design guidance and things, which might help you put some of those parameters together. Thinking about loss of views from an area or views onto particular heritage assets. There's all this evidence, I think, can be accumulated. But it is trickier because the national planning policy framework places a big emphasis on efficient use of land. And density doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be ugly. You can design quite dense developments in attractive ways. But I do think I would recommend looking at character generally in your settlement and what that means to you, so that you can give a bit more of an understanding about how height would impact on it.
Yeah, I see Claire's
Okay,
got a
thank
hand
you.
up, but I was just going to very quickly say, I think that design codes is a good route to go down on this kind of thing, and thinking about policies around height. You know, you might get some pushback, and you might have to come up with a compromise. You know, have some areas where you have to accept taller buildings, but it's for the vast majority of villages, you certainly wouldn't be expected to have anything over 2.5 stories, generally speaking. But Claire,
I just remembered, as an example, Caterham, their neighbourhood plan, which we worked on, have just actually got rid of, overthrown an application for a huge kind of structure in their town centre, very much based on the design codes they put forward in their neighbourhood plan. So go and have a look at that one. Sorry, carry on.
So Claire, take yourself off mute.
Sevenoaks did overturn this, refuse the planning application.
Oh, right.
It was the dreaded inspectorate that passed.
It's always that.
Okay,
sorry,
thank
Claire,
you.
Claire, do you want to, sorry, I keep interrupting you, Claire.
Take yourself off mute, Claire. Or maybe you haven't put your hand up.
That better?
Yeah, that's it. We can hear you.
Good. Claire Sharp from Bridgehurst Parish Council. It's another question about affordable housing. We've got Red Hill development, which was in Mayor's Court. They were selling houses at 450,000 as affordable housing. And when you look into it, it's because it was a 5% deposit, but that was still out of reach, like you said, out of police and nurses and most people, wages. In our plan, I don't suppose this is possible, but can you actually stipulate a certain affordability?
Not really, no. This is a major problem actually, nationally, in that the definition of what is affordable is set at a national level, and it's, you know, for market housing certainly it's 85% of the, you know, of the house price that would be, you know, on average in your area, which of course is vastly out of reach in most attractive rural southeast villages and towns. Rosemary, did you want to add something?
Yes, I just wanted to add that about the point about first homes, that I'm writing reports, you know, fairly regularly now that are including the sort of the first home type tenure. And then when I come to do the sort of the assessments for people in terms of affordability, I completely agree with you. It's they are not always the most affordable option available. So it is something that obviously, you know, we're aware of, and it's coming up that this type isn't always affordable, and we're putting that in our reports to demonstrate that fact.
I think I've seen neighbourhood plans have policies about, you know, amongst that proportion of affordable homes, the 35% typically that local planning authorities require. They've actually said, you know, a percentage of that would have to be social rent or that kind of thing. Is that something that can be done within a neighbourhood plan policy, Alison, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that comes back to the first question about, you know, you can't necessarily change the percentage of affordable housing to be delivered, but you can have a say on the sort of affordable housing, the category of affordable housing. There is an example of one neighbourhood plan down in Lewis, which did attempt to try and do this, tackle this subject of affordability. And whether you could reduce the 85% of market house price. And they did get a policy in their plan, so it's worth having a look. But I don't think it has much teeth, because you're kind of relying on the goodwill of developers to do that. If there is a developer that is, you know, somewhat altruistic, if the two ever can go together, then, you know, potentially it could happen. The only other way, Claire, I suppose, is if you were to bring forward your own affordable housing on land through a community land trust, that you've got much more control, therefore, over what the development is and how it's priced. That would be the other route through. And I know Faversham, where I live, for instance, they've just recently set up a community land trust and are looking at something similar. So that might be something to have an explore of.
And it's a community
land trust. There's a national body that represents community land trusts. If you Google them, or we can try and find it and put it in the chat. There's lots of them around, but again, it's kind of, and there are, you know, it's about finding land in your area, be it parish council owned, or if you've got a landowner that, you know, wants to gift some land to it, or you'd have to get a loan to actually buy the land and then look at ways to fund its development. But have a look into that, because there's lots of them around now.
Yeah, we've got Keith had his hand up, but I was just going to come on to another couple of questions. But Keith, carry on while I have a look at the question.
It was just to add to the point about community land trusts. Obviously, you've mentioned the Kent Community Housing Hub, which provides advice locally on all aspects of co-housing community land trusts. We've got land advisors and so forth. And if we send you the contact details for that at the end, we ran a session like this on it previously. Then Claire and anyone else, you can pick up with some local guidance on how to take that forward too.
Absolutely.
And thank you, Alison, for putting it in the chat.
That's all right. I'll put it there.
So someone asked, and I think it was asked a bit on the chat, what is a typical cost for a parish council neighbourhood plan? I mean, it's very hard to say. It will be more than the grant available. I can pretty much guarantee that. And so, like I say, you know, I would suggest to a parish council embarking on a neighbourhood plan to set aside you know, at least as much as you're going to get through the grant in each year of your neighbourhood plan. And I know that's a bit late for you now in this stage of the year, but you know, when you're sort of maybe when you're coming around to setting your budgets in December, January time for next year, do make sure you put in some budget. You know, if you don't spend it, you know, you can plow it into something else, but you know, it is worth setting aside budget of your own as well as the grants. Oh, and someone's also asked this very tricky question, deal with the conflict of, how do you deal with the conflict of interest between central government targets and local needs wants? Well, I suppose that comes back to the point about sort of high rise, but also more widely about, you know, the volume of housing is obviously the government has this appetite to build 300,000 homes a year. And that may not reflect your local circumstances, is that you know, you might be in a protected area from a conservation heritage point of view, or from an environmental sort of area of outstanding natural beauty point of view, or there may just not be suitable land in your community. So it is a difficult balance or challenge. And I suppose really it's that change is coming. If it hasn't hit you already, I think, you know, we live in a changing world, and I would say that you are better off with a plan. It doesn't have to be a neighbourhood plan. It could be a parish plan, or it could be having an affordable housing plan, or even design guidance of your own, you know, village design guides. They, you know, they still have really useful value in informing developers on the aspirations, or the or if it's in the neighbourhood plan, actually telling them how new development should come forward. So with a plan, you've got better ability to shape the change that's coming, rather than if you don't have a plan, I would say. So anything you'd add to that, Alison?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, you know, inevitably each government that comes in is going to have its own priorities. And at the moment, you know, housing is high on the government priority. There's a housing crisis that they've set out in their white paper, and that's what they're trying to deliver, you know, fundamentally. Therefore, you know, it might be that there's a little bit less scope at this stage in your neighbourhood plans to kind of have a great say on that beyond the types of housing. But then there's other things that are less high on perhaps the government's agenda that are perhaps being a little bit ignored, that we might want to therefore emphasise through our neighbourhood plans, like, as Jen says, design, like environment and biodiversity, like getting people walking and cycling, like making our village centres more accessible and attractive. So there's plenty of things there that are still to do. And I think without your plan, you know, you potentially miss out on having that bit of influence.
I'm aware we've gone well over time and a few people have left out. So what is interesting is that we have some courses in the pipeline with Kent Association of Local Councils. So we'll be telling you about those on email, probably coming up sort of June, July time. Those will be coming on stream. So our friends at Kent Association of Local Councils are putting those on. We might do some further longer courses with rural Kent as well. So we'll keep you informed of what's going on there. and they of course do run lots of different training courses throughout the year on a range of things, village halls, etc., village shops still, I think. So, you know, we would love to see you at some of those events. And then a final question, and this is a sort of a bit of a nub kind of key question that we often get asked, Alison, you won't be surprised to hear this one, is given the cost of the effort in producing a neighbourhood plan, how effective are they in stopping borough councils overruling the wishes of the parish? Well, wishes is a difficult one, so I'm just going to unpick this a little bit. So if you can evidence the reason why something shouldn't happen, then that puts you in a much stronger position than simply the wishes or wants of a community. So let's say you want to protect an important view out from your recreation ground or something like that. If you simply say the village wishes to protect this view, then it might be overruled. But if you can do an assessment of that view, taking photographs, showing where the view is from, that it's from public land, maybe a bench in the recreation ground, and that out with, you know, then you can suddenly, you can turn that into a policy that you can protect that particular view or a range of views within your community. That's just an example. And I would say the key to it is once your plan is made, it has the same status in planning as a local plan. So it isn't like the local plan would override your plan. You have to be in general conformity with the strategic policies in your local plan, but they can't override the neighbourhood plan policies once made. So that's a sort of you know, a reassurance to you that these plans are being tested, and that Alison talked about appeals. You know, they are being tested in planning appeals now and are generally winning. They don't generally get, you know, the examiners appreciate, or the inspectorate appreciates all the effort that goes into these neighbourhood plans. And if they've gone through an incredibly robust process, which is, you know, the 2 consultations on the neighbourhood plan, at least 2, the examination and then referendum, then the inspectorate are not looking to overrule these plans or override these plans, although there are examples where that seems to have happened. So, yeah. I've got to go to Eastbourne now for another meeting. So virtually, fortunately, I've got to be there in 3.5 minutes. But it's been lovely to see you all. We'd love to keep this conversation going. I don't know if Alison will be able to do that, but we will be in touch. We've got all your email addresses and some of the people who weren't here. All the slides will go up on the website as soon as we can. The video of this will go up on the website as soon as possible, probably after the bank holiday now. We'd like to thank Rural Kent for hosting this and for advertising it. We'd like to thank you very much for coming. Keith, have I missed anything that we needed to say?
I think you've covered my exit from the meeting brilliantly.
Oh, right. Okay.
I just want to say thank you to Alison, yourself and Rosemary, and for all of you for taking part today. It's been a fascinating overview, great questions. Clearly, this is an agenda that's going to roll on for time to come, I think. But I wish you well in the endeavours you take forward in your own communities. We will be running some more events like this, and look at next week for an announcement on work around net zero from us, which will affect village halls and community planning and all sorts of things. So we'll be in touch on that towards the end of next week. But I wish you a really lovely long weekend, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you for coming.
Cheers, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Probably want to stop recording, Rosemary.